What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Jeffrey Wilson, Patrick J. Militich, Eater of Worlds, Slayer of Dragons, coming to you live and direct for another episode. And I tell you what, I'm pretty freaking stoked for our guest today. The man has created memories that will last forever, that have made me lose my mind in my living room. Patrick, how are you doing today, brother?
I'm doing great, and I know you've been geeking about this for some time, so I'm happy for you.
Well, I'm sure you want to pick his brain too.
Yeah, I do. I definitely do, because he's done so many things in life, from in front of the camera, behind the camera,
yes,
running the show, doing all kinds of things, and now brewing some beer, having a good time in life. He deserves it, so I'm pumped.
Well, we are talking about none other than author of Controversy Creates Cash, as well as the former honcho over there at WCW World Championship Wrestling, former general manager at World Wrestling Entertainment. Mr. Garrett Bischoff is joining us on the program today. How are you doing today, sir?
That's the longest intro I've ever had. Congratulations. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Fantastic, man. Fantastic. We had tried to get Eric on, I think, a week or so ago, but just had some logistical issues. These things happen, but here he is, and so very, very thankful. Man, before we get started, obviously in the meat and potatoes, how the hell is it up there in Cody, Wyoming, man? I've seen some of your interviews take place up at your house, and I'm just like, wow, wide open spaces without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I built a house here for a reason. There's only 500,000 in the whole state of Wyoming. State of Wyoming's probably about the size of Minnesota and Iowa combined. So there are a lot of wide open spaces here. But we live right outside of Yellowstone National Park, so I'm close to the things I like to do. I like to hunt. I like to fish. I like to hike. I like to ride horses. So everything I like is right here.
Wow, that sounds like retirement to me, but you're not retired. You stay very busy, and in addition to your accolades, you are a co-host with Conrad Thompson on the podcast 83 Weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are a wrestling fan, specifically the Nitro era, definitely recommend checking that out.
Yeah, I tried retiring, and someone forgot to tell me that the bills keep coming in the mail. Just because you reach a certain point doesn't mean that the mortgage payment stops and the car payment stop. And it's like shit gets way more expensive the older you get, too. I noticed that.
Yeah, it's what Steve Austin says, has to stay busy to pay those gimmicks they call bills. Sorry, Pat.
And not to obviously, you've done enough in your life where you probably could have retired, but I think you just are the type of guy that you have to stay busy, or once the wheels stop rolling, that's trouble for you.
Well, it's a little bit of both. I mean, had I been smarter, wiser, and wouldn't have succumbed to the belief that I was bulletproof and would be successful forever, which kind of gets a hold of you after a while, I could have probably retired if I'd have been smarter about it. But I've always lived my life pretty close to the edge. I've taken big risks. I've tried new things, and all of those things cost money. You mentioned the beer business. I'm no longer in that beer business, but I spent about $250,000 getting a really, really good education about it.
Wow.
Like I'm one of the smartest guys in the country that isn't in the beer business. And I paid dearly for that education.
That's a tough business. There's millions of microbreweries everywhere, right?
Yeah, well, when we first got started, it was really more of a hobby, all kidding aside. We live in Cody, Wyoming. Buffalo Bill Cody built the town. There's only about 8,000 people that live here during the normal course of the year, but during the summer, there's usually 3 or 4 million people that are coming through Cody on their way to Yellowstone. So my brilliant idea out of my porch with a 12-pack of my closest friends was, hey, why don't we come up with Buffalo Bill Cody beer, and we'll sell each and every one of these tourists, a 6-pack of beer, a T-shirt, a hat, and a bumper sticker on their way through. So it started out as a hobby, but it got a lot bigger than that and more complicated. And it is a complicated business now. 5-6 years ago, it was a new up-and-coming business. Now there's a microbrewery, right next to every, 7-Eleven in every town, big and small.
You know that Buffalo Bill is actually from LeClair, Iowa, right? I mean, I live almost right above LeClair, Iowa, here on the Mississippi River.
I do know that. I do know that. I was anxious to talk to you about that. I'm a Buffalo Bill history freak.
I'm actually, his house is right out there, like just on massive, massive acreage. It's pretty cool. You can do a little tour of his house.
And there are several breweries. There is a distillery down there in LeClair, and I tell you what, if you ever want to restart that idea, LeClair is probably the place to do it. And reason being is LeClair is a hotbed for tourism because of antique archaeology. My buddies Mike Wolf and Frank Fritz, who have American Picker on Discovery, that's where their original shop is.
That's right. I remember. I watched that show quite frequently, and I've always noticed that in the background. About every third or fourth episode, you realize you're in LeClair.
Yeah,
and everybody thinks of Buffalo Bill Cody as being, Cody, Wyoming, the Wild West, and all that. That was later in his life. He grew up in a farm there in Iowa. Later moved on to Kansas. I mean, his very, very fascinating life. But you're absolutely right. LeClair, Iowa, is the home of Buffalo Bill Cody. That's cool.
Right. So if you ever want to restart that idea, that's the place you're going to sell a lot of the beer.
I think I might have to take you up on that. That could be interesting.
Kind of an untapped market,
Let
too.
me know. We'll rock it.
Yeah.
I won't drink any of the profits. I don't drink anymore.
Yeah, but you spend money, though, don't you? Come on, brother.
Yeah.
Well,
a little bit.
Part of your background, Eric, so fascinating, bro. I mean, obviously, you've had a lot of documentaries, et cetera, et cetera. I was quite fascinated. I mean, I saw in Nitro, you would kind of, I didn't know necessarily without knowing your background if you were kind of playing the role of a martial artist when you did karate kicks. But I mean, some of your like roundhouse, I'm like, wow, that looks good. But you have an amateur kickboxing background as well as amateur wrestling, I believe, but a pretty significant amateur kickboxing background.
Yeah, I got heavily, whenever I find something interesting to me, I tend to, just deep dive into it for extended periods of time. And, I was at a point in my life I started martial arts really when I was in my teens, but got serious about it and could afford to do it full time, in my mid 20s. And I really got into it. I traveled all over the country and competed in tournaments and fought on ESPN, all that good shit. But I realized I couldn't make any money doing it. So it's kind of like, well, I know I'm getting laid a lot. There's a lot of martial arts groupies out there. I'm having fun, but I can't pay my bills.
I'm sure, Pat, you know nothing about that.
Was that you and Joe Louis back in the day?
No, Joe Louis was a little bit before my time, and quite a bit. He was in a different league than I was in for sure. I came up with guys who I'm not sure who you'd really recognize, but in the late 70s, guys like Keith Vitale, Ray McCallum, John Longstreet, were some of the big names.
Oh, yeah.
And I trained with John Longstreet and Terry Norblum up in Minnesota.
You remember Dale Apollo Cook?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, all those guys. I remember growing up and watching, I can't even remember how old I was, probably a teenager at the time, watching the ESPN PKC kickboxing. So was that the group that you were fighting in?
Yeah, that was it. Joe Corley out of Atlanta, Georgia, had the PKA, and he was tied up with John Worley and Gordon Franks, Pat Worley, a couple of other people at different times. But really, it was ESPN, the PKA. And they also had fights. Bill Wallace fought one of my instructors, Pat Worley, on CBS Sports Spectacular.
Right.
Back in, that would have been like 1980 or so. That was, everybody thought martial arts is going to be the next big thing, but it just, everybody got greedy and they kind of screwed each other. It just went away.
That was back in the day when they had the tree light, the red lights and the green, or the red and the blue lights, right?
Yep.
In the corners, and you had to get 8 allotted kicks per round, or they would basically take points from you. And that was, I think, originally designed so that the real good boxers wouldn't come in and destroy everybody.
Well, that, and I think promoters were smart enough to recognize, or at least they believed, whether it was true or not, they believed firmly that the audience would respond better to kicking techniques. It was more exciting to watch. It was dynamic. It was different. So they really wanted to encourage kickers, and that's why they made that 7-count rule.
Yeah, when I first started doing that style of kickboxing, I absolutely hated it because I wasn't very flexible and I couldn't kick worth a shit. So I wore myself out getting the 8 kicks around.
Yeah, well, it takes your leg and your hips. It takes a lot more energy to move that muscle than it does to throw a jab. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
No doubt about it.
Well, and during that time, you ran across someone you wound up working with in wrestling, WCW, and Sonny Ono. Can you tell me how that relationship spawned?
Yeah, well, Sonny's from, this is like Iowa home week. We got Buffalo Bill Cody, we got Pat Miletich, we got Sonny Ono from Mason City. We're just covering the gamut.
Oh, nice,
here.
nice.
Yes, sir.
I'm from Iowa too, so yeah, this is an Iowa episode.
I met Sonny through my involvement in martial arts. Sonny was a Japanese stylist. He grew up in Tokyo, but somehow ended up in Mason City, Iowa. I never did quite figure that out, but he did, and he's lived there almost all of his life since then. But I met up. Sonny was a very highly ranked competitor. He was a bantamweight during the PKA kind of highlight, if you will, or high point. So, and he also competed in a traditional forms competition. He was known throughout the world for that. And we just became friends and traveled around together and kicked people in the head and got kicked in the head and chased girls.
Nice.
It sums it up. It's what we had in common.
And did he have an affinity for professional wrestling?
He didn't really. When I first met Sonny, I wasn't in the business at all. I've always been a fan of it, from the time I was a kid growing up in Detroit. Like everybody else, you watch it, you become a fan of it and things like that. But I never dreamt for a minute that I'd actually work in the wrestling business. It wasn't like it was a goal or something I aspired to.
Oh, got a little echo there. Pat, did you got a little echo? Yeah, so I find that so fascinating, Eric, because you weren't necessarily, like I said, you grew up in Detroit and then moved to Minnesota. And, what I admire about your career, it's weird because I kind of see parallels to myself. I started, obviously, a different level, but, I started as a photographer, then moved into voiceover acting, then started doing a podcast. So it's like you never know where exactly the day is going to take you. And your initial roll of the dice was you and Sonny going into Verne Gagne's office with what you had. It was a ninja throwing star game, which just sounds like something I totally would have bought as a kid. But and that's kind of where it spawned you into getting affiliated with AWA and then learning production. All of this didn't just fall in your lap. You had a willingness to learn and kind of be. Oh, Pat, whatever you just did. Okay.
Hold on.
Sure. See how this is, Pat? When you have a co-host, they always blame everything on you.
I just saw it.
It's your fault, Pat. Whatever you did, fault.
And you're spot on, Eric. You've been on the microphone before for broadcasts, and I tell you what, the guy that I work with at Access TV, Ron Kruk, he's the play-by-play. He's a prima donna. Jeff's a prima donna. Everybody's a prima donna.
It's your fault.
Of
Damn
course.
it, Pat. Learn how to use your.
Is that better, Jeff?
No, it is. It is. I don't know what you did, but it was because I'm watching him on screen, so I just saw whatever move you made, then the echo came. So, so that role, Eric, and just like being willing to accept where the kind of day was taking you. But initially, where did that Ninja Star toy come from that you guys went in and pitched to Verne Gagne?
Copious amounts of alcohol. I kid you not. Sonny and I we were at a tournament somewhere. I think it was at the Battle of Atlanta. And we got together and started pounding a couple beers. And, because Sonny grew up in Tokyo, and we're almost the same age. He's like 6 or 8 months older than I am. After a couple beers, I was like, Sonny, what was it like growing up as a kid in Tokyo? And he wanted to know the same for me. I grew up outside of Detroit in the 50s and the 60s, and shit was different back then. So we were kind of comparing notes on what our respective childhoods were like. And Sonny says, yeah, when we were kids, we used to play this game. We'd go around, up and down the streets around Tokyo, and they'd have milk bottle caps that they would find in the street because evidently people would buy bottles of milk in the store, pop the top, and just leave them in the street. And we would, play tag, throwing these milk bottle can or tops at each other like ninja stars. And I said, well, it's funny. When I was a kid in Detroit, we used to have rock fights. And I know it sounds violent, but it really wasn't. But we would take big clumps of dirt and rocks that we could find, and we'd throw them at each other because when you hit somebody, they kind of blew up like a grenade, And we'd have rock fights. That was how we spent our summer days usually, or evenings. So we were just kind of comparing those notes. And about, 2 hours later and 20 beers later, we had a whole pile of napkins sitting in front of us, and we sketched out this game. And then we sobered up and said, screw it, let's try to make that work. So we did.
He still ran with it.
And I have got to ask you about working with Verne Gagne. I remember him from when I was a kid, and I, knew about it because I started wrestling when I was 5 years old. So obviously Verne Gagne was an amazing wrestler when he was in college, and then a great professional wrestler. So, what was it like working with him?
I loved it. People. You'll hear different people have different opinions of Verne or recollections of working for him. But, for me, number one, I just liked him as a person. We got along well outside of the wrestling business, outside of the employer-employee relationship. We did a lot of pheasant hunting together. He was really into German short hair pointers. So was I. I used to raise them and train them and compete with German short hairs around the Midwest. And we just both shared a love of hunting, duck hunting, pheasant hunting, dogs, and obviously the wrestling business. And, you know, he gave me my first, I mean, if it wasn't for Verne Gagne, I wouldn't be talking to you guys right now. I wouldn't be here. Who knows where I would be? So many good things happened in my life as a result of my relationship with Verne, that no matter what, I'll never have anything but really positive things to believe and say about him. He was stubborn, you know, he was set in his ways, he was tough, but he was also kind, gentle, generous, and funny as hell. You know, it just depends on the moment, I guess.
I'm sure, given his background being a former national champion, how many times did he win national championships? Was he a 2 or 3 timer?
You know, I don't recall.
I think he was a 2 or 3 timer, maybe a 3 timer, but I'm sure because of his background, his demand for excellence of those around him was pretty high, and he was a very extreme personality at times, you know, just simply because, you know, wrestling does that to you.
Yeah, well, in order to get to the level that he was at, or Pat, even you've become, or a lot of other people that we know in the business now or in the sport, you don't get to be a Brock Lesnar level competitor, you know, in college if you're not a little bit, if you're not wired a little tight. You know, it takes a different kind of cat to get there. And you're right. Verne was, he suffered no fools. You know, he didn't tolerate fools. Let's put it that way. He could get hot. Funny thing about Verne is every time he got hot, you could see it coming, because he always talked like Jesus Christ, God damn it, and then he'd hit himself in the forehead like he was punishing himself.
Wow.
Damn it, Jesus, I told you not to do that. You know, Verne Gagne had a very distinct temper. When he lost it, you could hear it across the room, and you knew it was him. What's the best rant, and who did he go on a rant against that you remember? You know, he never did in front of me. That was another thing that was really weird, Pat. When I was hired, because Verne was very traditional. You know, we hear the term kayfabe, and I guess we all generally know what it means. But, you know, this is 1987 when I went to work for Verne, and I was like not allowed anywhere near the secret sauce. So anytime Verne was dealing with talent, you know, on an issue, good or bad, it was way out of my earshot. You know, he never would talk business in front of me for the longest time. Even when I was an announcer, he'd kayfabe me on certain things.
Yeah,
you know, when I was standing there working with him.
Yeah.
But he believed in you know, in the beginning, my feelings were kind of hurt. I was like, God, why wouldn't he? Doesn't he trust me, or doesn't he think I'm capable of, you know, being responsible with this kind of information? But it wasn't that. It was just he believed that it's like a magician. You know, it's like David Blaine. You know, you go to Las Vegas, you go there with your wife, your girlfriend, or friend, whatever, and, you know, you drop a couple $100 for a front row seat to a really cool magic show. You know, nobody's going to enjoy that show as much if somebody comes out and says, okay, David's going to do a bunch of really cool tricks, and let me show you before he does how they all work.
Yeah.
It would take the fun out of it. And Verne believed that. And as a result of finally understanding, you know, years and years and decades later, I think he was absolutely right. It keeps the magic is what makes it interesting.
Well, and we don't really kind of understand now, since kayfabe is gone, and I kind of get it now as an older cat, like how serious kayfabe was and how serious they protected the professional wrestling business. There was territory. This is how these guys made a living, and, you know, especially Verne, he set the bar so high. When you hear about, you know, the training he had these guys do. I mean, you look at some of the successes that came out of Verne's camp, from Ric Flair to Ken Patera, you know, the list, Iron Sheik, Khosrow Vaziri. I mean, Verne Gagne was really no joke. And honestly, man, it always kind of broke my heart, because I always loved the AWA growing up. And I mean, supposedly from what I understand, like, Verne just did not get the next evolution of wrestling, which kind of ultimately put him out of business, because he wound up losing all of his stars and really coming out of his own pocket to keep the promotion alive. You know, what are your thoughts on the end of the AWA and Verne's kind of intransigence as it relates to the changing of the professional wrestling business at that time?
Well, that's a good observation on your part, Jeff. And he was, when I said earlier he was stubborn, one of the things he was stubborn about, like a lot of guys, he wasn't the only one. You know, Jerry Jarrett fell into this category, a guy by the name of Don Owens out in Portland, Bob Geigel in the Midwest. Independent, you know, promoters, territory owners all over the country all fell victim to the same thing Verne did. But Verne was so stubborn, and he believed, you know, I was there at the end. In fact, I got hired in 1980. The wheels were falling off when they hired me. Let's put it that way. Hulk had already left. You know, Mean Gene, Bobby Heenan were already gone. All the top talent was gone. Kurt Hennig was gone. So many of the big stars that were driving Verne's promotion for so long were gone. They were in the WWF. And one of the things that Verne did, this is one of the things I always felt badly about for him. Verne was pretty smart and conservative with his money, and he built a beautiful, beautiful horse farm in an area called Lake Minnetonka, which is a really exclusive area outside of Minneapolis. And I think he had like 40 or 50 or 60 acres, some large amount of acreage right on the lake, and he owned it. That was his dream. He wanted to own his home so he could live there with his family, the rest of his life. And the state of Minnesota came along while the wheels were really falling off of AWA, and Verne was funding AWA out of his own pocket. He was refinancing his house because he owned it and he had equity in it, so he could go to the bank and pull out $500,000 whenever he needed it. The house was probably worth, even back in $1980, probably worth $40 to $50 million.
Whoa!
And the state of Minnesota came along and pulled the trigger on a law called eminent domain because they wanted to turn his home that he worked all of his life and paid for. They wanted to turn it into a public park, and they ended up offering him something like $4 or $5 million, which is way below market value. And Verne, being the stubborn guy that he was, he fought it. And he ultimately lost, but in the process of losing that fight, spent millions and millions of dollars on legal fees. But in the end, there's a park out there now.
Wow.
That's brutal. Not a fan of eminent domain.
Right.
Certainly not in Verne's case either. Jeez.
No, and it's like I said, the sad part was he not only lost his home, but because he mortgaged so much against that home to try to keep AWA alive. By 1990, it was just, that's when we would go for 3, 4, 5 weeks, sometimes longer, without paychecks. And, the handwriting was on the wall. It was pretty obvious what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, and even as a young wrestler, I mean, knowing it now, it is just so heartbreaking. But like watching the product, I forget what the challenge team or the team challenge. It was just crazy to see how his business and promotion went from where it was to where it finally wound up ending up. But man, we could keep you forever. But I want to ask you a few more things before we let you slide. Fast forwarding, I mean, obviously you, as WCW blew up, there was a lot of changing of the guard as far as who was kind of heading up booking, et cetera, et cetera. And from what I understand, the corporate people didn't want wrestling people in there, and you kind of sold yourself as more of a TV guy, even though you were kind of a wrestling guy, which helped kind of make yourself more palatable to the executives. Is that kind of correct, how you kind of got in as executive producer of Nitro and WCW?
Yeah, I was on my way out. I was ready to quit. I had created and sold a kids show to the Fox Kids Network back when they used to have one on the Fox channel. And I was already on my way to developing, television ideas and pursuing that. And I was so miserable working for Bill Watts, as was everybody else, that I was on my way out the door until they fired Bill. And then it became known that they were going to go in a completely different direction. And they really wanted to modernize WCW to be more of a television product and less of a wrestling product. Wrestling in the traditional, format, because it's still, WCW in the early 90s was still very much like the old NWA Crockett territory. The shows were formatted kind of the same, storylines were the same, a lot of the people were the same. Yeah. So when WCW made it clear that they were going to hire an executive producer to modernize the television product, I thought, well, what the hell? I mean, who's going to be more? I mean, I have no experience, but I've got as much as anybody else that's going to apply for that job. Somebody may have come along with more television experience than I did, but they certainly wouldn't have more wrestling experience than me. So I was able to convince executives that, and not just convince them. I showed them how I would do it. I showed them how I would reformat a show. I explained to them how I would approach the challenges we had getting advertisers to advertise our show. I went into how we were going to rebrand the property to kind of overcome a lot of the negative stigma that we'd, been saddled with for so long. So it wasn't just me telling them, it was me showing them, right. And eventually got the gig.
Which, history was made. And, part of that, going back to like Verne being so old school, you definitely were a part of that evolution of wrestling. And, success leaves clues, because for 83 weeks you kicked, the top cable, top wrestling show's ass for, which was very impressive. Something I also found impressive, like the title of your book, Controversy Creates Cash, which is absolutely true in this kind of tabloid world. Anybody who understands narrative knows about the Aristotelian plot curve, the rising action, the climax, the falling action. And you had a very similar formula with Sarsa as you formulated your formats and storylines. Could you kind of explain a little bit what that was? Because I thought that was really, really pretty cool.
Yeah, it was cool. And it just, it just shows what can happen if you pay attention sometimes. I was in Orlando. We were producing our shows out of Orlando in '96 because the Olympics were in Atlanta, and all of any freelance crew, whether it was cameras, audio, whatever it is, lighting, every freelance crew in America was booked for the Olympics, and we still had to produce a live show. So I went to Disney to do it because they were self-contained. You didn't have to hire freelancers. They had their own employees, their own equipment. You could just pay through the nose and use their stuff. So we went down to Disney, and while I was down there, I read an article that was written by Dick Ebersol, actually, who had a long history with Vince McMahon and WWE. And Dick Ebersol was also the executive producer of what was going to be the Winter Olympics that were coming up. And one of the questions that was posed in the story is, what are you going to do? The Winter Olympics suck. Nobody's watching them. What are you going to do to turn that around? And Dick, went into a pretty lengthy explanation about how, rather than just covering the action, they were going to really help you understand the competitors. You're going to get to know them on a personal level. You're going to build story. Dick talked about, we got to make people look forward to the Olympics. And that, to me, that was anticipation. Yeah. And it's a psychological thing. We grew up as kids. You can't wait for Christmas. You can't wait for your birthday. You can't wait till your first day of school. Can't wait till your first date. Can't wait to get your driver's license. But you're always in this state of can't wait for something, right? The anticipation is part of the human condition. So I thought, man, if I could really tap into that, so focus on story. Let's get to know people. Let's make them believable and real, not like superheroes and garbage men and IRS agents and clowns. Let's let them be their real people and turn up the volume on them a little bit. So that's how I kind of stumbled into that. I took Dick Ebersol's explanation of what he was going to do for the Winter Olympics, and I simply adapted it to fit my business.
So that's SARSA, the acronym being story, anticipation, reality, surprise, and action.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And I to this day, if I sit down with somebody and they really want to get into creative, I look at everything through that filter. Is there story? Where did the story start? What's the middle? What's the end? What's the story? Right. What's the journey? If you don't have that, you don't have anything. How are you building anticipation? You don't have to do it every single week, but you've got to convince the audience over a period of time, an arc, if you will, that there's something there to look forward to each and every week. You've got to build that. So reality,
for sure.
If a character or a story isn't at least somewhat believable, if the viewer can't say to themselves, most of the time subconsciously, I know all this other shit is scripted, but these two guys really do hate each other.
I tell you, that's what it was, man. When I don't even remember 2000. I'm 45 now, so whatever it was, having been raised on NWA in that format, I'm telling you, Eric, like the millions of other people, when like Lex Luger came out after being 24 hours earlier on WWE, or the whole Outsider storyline, I just marked out. I'm like, look, dude, this isn't supposed to be happening right now. Week to week.
And what was cool, and the reason I say easy, that sounds arrogant, but in a way it was easy simply because it had never been done before. When all of a sudden, people are watching a show that they've been watching for weeks or years or decades, in some cases, and all of a sudden they see something happening in front of them live that they've never seen before, it's easy to get them to believe it's real.
Yeah. I sure did. I mean, it was awesome, man. It was really, obviously nothing lasts forever, but you guys rode that bad boy till the wheels fell off. And it was, as a fan, it was just really, really cool to watch. I remember having a server job, and they had two TVs in the back, and one side I'd have on Raw and the other side I'd have on Nitro, and everybody who got off work would just sit there and drink and just, lose our shit over wrestling. Such a great time, man.
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
No, I was going to say, I wish we could go back to those days.
Oh, man, tell me about it.
Now, and the thing that's interesting is, while you're talking about this is something that the sport of mixed martial arts has never really truly had, because, well, the biggest company in the business is the UFC, and they've never understood this for some reason. They haven't been able to really truly build to big, massive fights. It's just this conveyor belt of fight after show after show after show. And I mean, anymore, it's hard to even keep up with the names of anybody.
Right.
And it's unfortunate because they're missing, I think, a very important, that cocktail that built, the huge boxing matches, the Sugar Ray Leonards against Hagler, Hearns, Iran Barkley, all those guys. There was that storylines and those building to those crescendos in boxing. And I don't think the UFC has ever really been able to do that. Every once in a while, the lightning strikes with a Conor McGregor, but that's about it.
Well, they'll get lucky every once in a while. Connor's one good example, but if you think, and I don't watch, I'm not like a hardcore, knowledgeable UFC guy. I'm not.
Neither am I, Eric. I'm serious. I don't even watch shows. I do broadcasts about 40 times a year, live shows for the live fights on Mark Cuban's network. But besides that, I really don't even watch it.
I mean, there's so much I don't know, and occasionally I'll watch, if it's a fight that sounds interesting to me. But for the most part, a small handful of guys were around long enough to build, story and to get some of that mainstream media. But it just seems like, every other week you've got a new heavyweight champion. Every other week. Honestly, if every world champion in the UFC right now came to my house to share pizza, I wouldn't know 3/4 of them.
Right.
That's funny and sad.
It is, and I think part of it is because UFC grew so quickly. They haven't needed to do that yet. They're quite successful from a financial point of view. It's not necessary for them yet, but I really do believe it will be in order for them to continue to grow, because people right now, the UFC is the star and the fighters are just kind of interchangeable. But I think for the sport, and it's great, they've done a phenomenal job, but at some point you're going to have fighters that people really, really want to see get beat or really want to see win.
Right.
Well, and it's weird because, Conor was such an anomaly, and, I think he was that element of professional wrestling that I kind of missed, and when you have real fighting. You have fighters now who are just, they are just trying so hard. It's just not organic, and it's just like, they're just trying real hard to be Conor. But I think UFC does kind of need some of that flavor. But before we that's the
thing, and I'm in no hurry, guys. I don't know if you are, but that's the thing with a guy like Conor. It's very organic to him. That's who he really is. Yeah, he probably turns the volume up a couple decibels, but he's not acting. He's not pretending. It's not forced. It is who he is, and he's smart enough to be able to pull it off. But if you're not, and you don't have that personality, it's like listening to a bad comedian or a bad singer.
Exactly.
It's just fucking horrible. You just don't care.
Well, just like a bad wrestling promo. Yeah, it's terrible. It's like, wow, please somebody yeah. It's really transparent, but hopefully, like I said, hopefully they'll have more of that element in the UFC or just MMA in general, because I think, I don't know, it could be, like I said, they need to develop the personalities and stuff, but we'll see. Well, going back to what do you think about the product now, Eric? I know it's cool. You have a kind of zen attitude about when I hear you and Conrad, and I hear Conrad losing his shit. I'm just like, wow, dude. And you have a very kind of tempered response. Like, you don't really reciprocate with that level of volume. But it's like, what are your thoughts on the product now? I found something you said rather interesting, and it's pretty true. You had guys back in the 60s and 70s, your real old school workers, Johnny Valentine types, seeing your Rock and Roll Express or your Midnight Rockers or your High Flyers. And they're like, oh, man, they're killing the business. But, the business wound up to grow to accept that and evolved. And now here we are, my old ass and Jim Cornette's old ass and other people who were just like, the business is dead. The business is dead. It's all just about high spots and let me get my shit in. And, no psychology. What are your thoughts on the product today and how it differs so much from yesteryear?
Look, everything has changed. Everything is different today than it was. Go back and watch an episode of I Love Lucy. And look at how that was written and produced. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And now look at, what we would consider, look at Modern Family, and compare the two. Of course, people's senses of, our sense of humor has changed. Our expectations as an audience has changed. we become desensitized to a certain degree about entertainment and what we find funny and not funny anymore.
True.
So everything has changed, and the NFL, well, going back to, the 60s when I was a kid, the 70s, I moved to Pittsburgh in 1968. I think it was the year that Terry Bradshaw was a rookie. It was this big sensation. And guys like Franco Harris, and there was just so many, Jack Ham, there were so many great football players back in the day. Well, football was a much different sport then. The athletes, training, science, nutrition, technique, coaching, everything has evolved so much that the sport of football is not the same as it used to be. And wrestling's the same way. And you'll hear people, you'll go to a sports bar and you'll sit down next to somebody that's my age or older, and they'll piss and moan because back in the 60s, that's when football was really football. And a game isn't as much fun anymore. In the meantime, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry,
Right.
And here's what I found myself, is I tend to want to look back fondly at periods of time when, whether it's martial arts or wrestling or whatever, the first Star Wars movie, those things all had a really big impact on me because of the stage in my life that I was in. And as you get older, you look for different things. You have different expectations. And I think that's true in wrestling. Sometimes we don't allow ourselves to go, yeah, I know, it was fun when I was 16 or 18, but, the business moves on.
Right.
And I think if you look at the business really objectively, the wrestling business objectively right now, and you go, well, wait a minute, WWE has a $6 billion market cap. They've got 25 million wrestling fans around the world. They own one of the 3 most successful streaming platforms on planet Earth.
Yes.
I mean, they've got 5 hours of wrestling in prime time.
Is that hurting them, though? I mean, there's been this whole thing about Raw's ratings being so low,
No, it's not hurting them at all. And that's just, when people that don't really understand ratings start talking about them, it's dangerous.
Right.
If you look at WWE, and I don't have any inside information, I'm not privy to anything, okay? I'm speculating. I want to make sure people know that. But I would venture to say that the value of an ad inside of WWE programming is exponentially higher than it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Even though everybody else in the television business is suffering because of streaming, your cable networks, 5 years from now, you're not going to recognize the television industry because of the impact that streaming is having on it.
Right.
But WWE is plugging along. They're not only holding on to their audience, and yes, it'll fluctuate, especially during the football season, but for the most part, they're holding on to their audience, but more importantly, their teen audience, which is one of the more sought-after demographics by advertisers. Their teen audience is growing, and their female audience is growing. Advertisers don't give two shits whether or not they lose guys 50 and over. They don't want them anyway. They want they want young kids, and they want women. That's where the money's at, and now they're doing fine.
Yeah, and Vince is about to start the XFL.
That's bizarre, but whatever. I don't know why he's going back to that. If I get my ass kicked once really, really good, I'm not going back for another one.
I found that odd too. I mean, he is a tenacious person, so that does make sense. I mean, speaking of sort of new products, I mean, what were your thoughts on All In and the fact that they sold out, and there is somewhat of a viable product out there other than the WWE?
I think there's going to be a lot more viable products out there other than the WWE, because streaming now, even 5 years ago, the cost, the bandwidth alone to stream an event live and have it go off almost flawlessly, the cost of doing so was prohibitive. Most producers, most promoters couldn't really afford to do it. They couldn't take the risk. Now, because technology has evolved and streaming is becoming so much more available to people, you're going to have people like Cody Rhodes and the Bucks who are going to promote successful live events and stream them that are going to capture the audience's imagination, because it's different.
Yeah.
They just want to see something different.
Dick flips and all.
There you go.
Jim Cornette's favorite. So the new NWA, I mean, obviously it's a slice of nostalgia. Do you think that's just something that they're doing kind of in name only, or are they trying to in some way do some kind of territorial thing that resembled the National Wrestling Alliance, or is this just kind of symbolic?
No, I think, I met with Billy Corgan a couple months ago in Chicago, and I've known Dave Lagana since I worked with him in WWE. I think they're very sincere about what they're very serious about what they're doing. I think that they've got a pretty good concept in terms of how they want to do it. I'm not sure where they are on their execution, but I didn't walk away from my lunch with either one of them thinking, oh, they're just pretending they're in the wrestling business. This is just to look like they are.
Right.
I think they're really serious about it, and I think there's a way to do it. I think there is a way to bring back regional territories and within the independent kind of scene and create an independent network that would allow that to happen. And I think people would be interested in it.
Is television essential to that? Getting television?
No.
Okay.
No, not anymore. 2 years ago, I would have said yes.
Okay. Yeah. With streaming. Yeah, you're right.
No, I mean, literally, if I had to or needed to or wanted to, I could probably put up a live event here in Cody, Wyoming at the municipal auditorium and do it for under $75,000, and it wouldn't look too bad. So it's attainable now, where 2 years ago it wouldn't have been. I think the mistake that anybody would be making right now that wanted to try to build a wrestling brand or an MMA brand for that matter is to try to do it on television, because it's just too prohibitive. It'll eat up all your resources, and it's not really necessary. People will find you. If you've got a product out there, they will find you.
That is so fascinating because, like you just said, TV was so essential for the growth of these promotions, like you said, up until 2 years ago. And this medium of, the internet has just, obviously it changes everything, but it's just so fascinating.
TV is going to be dead.
And radio.
I agree with you, Pat. I think television as we know it is going to be a lot like Blockbuster. You'll remember it.
Yeah,
but great
but
point.
Not much.
Great point.
Remember Blockbuster?
And that's the thing. I know a lot of people are trying to make those moves, and Mark Cuban doing the HD, the high definition stuff first, and then technology had to catch up to what he was doing. He was ahead of the curve, but I know he's already thinking ahead of the game in terms of television into the digital world. I know that.
He's a cool cat. I like Mark. I got a chance to work with him a little bit in WWE, and he's such a cool guy.
He is. He's very laid back. You would never, if you didn't know who he was, you certainly wouldn't guess that he was a billionaire by just standing there and talking to him. And he's into the wrestling stuff too. He sees the pro wrestling, the New Japan Pro Wrestling on the same network as we are, Access TV, and now the Women of Wrestling that the owner of the Los Angeles Lakers funded and launched that. And the kind of an interesting concept, to be honest with you, Eric, is, and you're privy to it, I'm sure, but it's based on something for young girls to look up to. These women, these pro wrestlers, are supposed to be emulating, superheroes, female superheroes.
It is interesting, and I think WWE is doing the same thing. But I think, again, we go back to WWE and the impact that they've had on where we are in the business today. I think, excuse me, I think there is so much more opportunity right now for women in the sport than there ever has been any time in history, and primarily because WWE decided, partly for business reasons and partly for the right reasons, to really start showcasing women more. Well, now other people are doing it, like the group out of LA, and there'll be somebody else that's going to do the same thing. And there'll be thousands of girls aspiring and working towards an opportunity in the business, whereas 3 or 4 years ago, there might've been 50 or 60. So it's a fun time. It's really fun to be a fan at this point and understand a little bit about technology and a little bit about the business of television and entertainment, and then seeing things change just day after day after day. There's new shit happening every day. It's cool.
So what are your thoughts on moving? I mean, you seem like you would dive back into it. Would you do that? I mean, you've kind of been on the fringes a little bit, haven't you?
I've been so far out on the fringes, I forgot my zip code. I guess it all depends. Who knows? I probably would, because I'm an entrepreneur. I was born an entrepreneur, and I'll be one till the day I die. And if somebody comes to me with what they think is a great idea, It's real easy for me to get excited about it. And I do miss wrestling. I miss the storytelling. I miss working with young talent, teaching them how to get good on a mic and how to create a good, interview. I've never, I'm not a professional wrestler. I would suck at trying to teach somebody how to do it in the ring. But in terms of creating their character and doing great promos, that I'm decent at.
I was going to ask you that after everything you went through, all the headaches of WCW and the politics and just, your Russos, your core, just all that drama. I was wondering if you would, not necessarily regrets, but would be willing to jump into back into something like that, considering all the headaches involved. Potentially.
Yeah, but but for me, right, what I wouldn't do is try to run a company by myself like I did before.
Right.
What I wouldn't do is, be responsible for people's livelihoods, hiring and firing people. I just don't ever want to be in that position again. But what I would love to do is help somebody else, you know what I mean, on the creative side, or, understanding the psychology of storytelling and how to translate the physical psychology into drama inside of a ring. That's all stuff I'm pretty decent at. But I miss that part of it. And I really miss working with really young talent. Because when if you take 10 people who are brand new to the business and are given this opportunity, 7 or 8 of them aren't probably ever going to really get it. They might be average to okay, or maybe a little above average, but 1 or 2 of those 10 people are going to be a star if you give them enough time and you nurture it along. And when you finally get that one talent that's starting to emerge, and you go, wow, this person's got it. He or she really's got it. That's like, it's like winning a lottery ticket. It's really exciting.
Eric, as you talk more and more, I'm sitting here saying to myself, because I wrote a concept for a mixed martial arts organization and presented it to Showtime when I was at Showtime, because they had been burned 3 times in a row by mixed martial arts organizations who either just screwed up so badly or sold out to the UFC that the Showtime execs, who I get along with very well, great guys, they just said, you know what, we're just burned out. We're burned out on the MMA. And they had meetings on it, and they wanted to do it. They just couldn't talk everybody into staying within the MMA world. So Espinoza and the crew went full time in on boxing, and now HBO has dropped boxing. They've done a great job of putting HBO out of the boxing industry because they did it so well. But I tell you what, with your expertise and a concept written by me, I'm not saying, Mike, you would probably change my concept, but you might be needed in mixed martial arts, and I tell you what, we might not make a bad team if it ever happened.
That'd be kind of fun. I would love
with your creative mind. I tell you what, it might be more than kind of fun.
Easy E in the Croatian sensation. I like it.
I would love it. I would love it. That's one.
Yeah, let's
get I haven't done in the business yet. I've promoted small shows before, but everything I've reffed, I've judged, I've fought, I've coached, I've commentated, been on. So I've done a lot of stuff within the sport, but
forgot about those championships, champ.
Well, but I tell you what, it would be amazing to have Eric. The more I think about it, it's a perfect fit, actually.
Well, let's get together after the show at some point and see what you got going. I'll share with you an idea that I kind of created and almost pitched about 6 months ago, and I decided, I'm just not ready to pitch it yet. So we'll exchange ideas. How's that?
I love it.
The stars could be aligning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, before we let you slide, Eric, again, what are you up to now? And how did you get linked up with Conrad in 83 Weeks? I tell you, again, ladies and gentlemen, check out 83 Weeks and Conrad Thompson and Eric Bischoff. You will not be disappointed.
I met Conrad through Bruce Pritchard, who's a mutual friend of mine, or a mutual friend of ours. And
Brother Love.
Bruce came to Brother Love. He said, man, you're not going to believe this guy, Conrad Thompson. He's like this rich banker in Georgia or in Alabama.
Yeah.
And he'll pay you, a bunch of money, fly you out first class if you come to his house and sit around and talk wrestling with him and a couple of his buddies. Jesus. And my first reaction was, that's kind of pervy. I'm not sure I want to do that. I don't know this cat. I don't know his 3 or 4 friends. I'm just not so sure I want to go to Alabama and be stuck in somebody's basement talking about wrestling. What if I can't get away?
You walk in and Chris Hansen's there. What are you doing here?
No, but what I did, shit, right?
Oh, that was brutal.
But I got to his house, And he's got this big, beautiful house. He's got this man cave that could, compete with any wrestling Hall of Fame anywhere on the planet. I mean, he's got more Ric Flair memorabilia than Ric Flair does. And we sat down, we had fun, and then about 6 months later, he said, "Hey, let's do this podcast." And it's a blast. I just got back literally a couple hours ago. I was in New York. I was in Rochester at a comedy club doing a live show with Conrad. And I never thought, first of all, I'm not funny. I know I'm not funny. I don't try to be funny. But if someone would have said to me, "Oh, you're going to do a live show December 15th in Rochester, New York at a comedy club," I would have said, "Fuck you. It's not going to happen." But here we were.
How'd it go?
It was great. I mean, it was so much fun. And here's what I've learned, and this really just dawned on me in the last month or two is, I'm a performer. I love doing that. And when I don't do it, a certain part of my brain goes dormant, the creative side, because if you're a performer, no matter what you're doing, you have to be creative. You have to use a part of your brain that you typically don't use. And I found myself when I quit performing in front of the camera, I started feeling like, wow, I just don't have that energy anymore. I don't have that desire to go out and perform anymore until I went out and did it. And I went, holy crap, this is fun.
That's awesome.
I'm having a blast. And so now, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a podcast and comedy tour.
I saw you guys advertising that, and, not to make it about us, but Pat and I, we have another show, a little more third rail, called The Conspiracy Farm. It's, 2 million plus listeners, over 100 countries, and we're actually in the process of taking it on the road. So we found our biggest city in the United States is L.A., and so we kind of have a comedy club booked. So I'm just like, we're not funny, but we just want to maybe tell some stories with some humor. Because I was just wondering, when I saw you guys, I'm like, you guys are kind of talking wrestling. It's not so much comedy, but you guys have a huge audience who want to hear you guys talk about wrestling. And hopefully,
and wrestling can inherently be funny. When you
for sure.
bring up some of the crazy shit that happened. I went on, and one of the stories that I tell is the time I had to wake up Dennis Rodman out of his. Wake him up in order to go do an interview on Howard Stern, like at 6 o'clock in the morning at in New York City. And we were staying at the Waldorf Astoria and couldn't get Dennis out of bed. So finally his manager or agent gave me his keys, said, "Here, go wake him up." And I go to open up the door, and, it's Dennis Rodman pounding Carmen Electra. It's like, well, no wonder he didn't answer the door.
Nice.
That brother was busy. And of course, as I tell that story, and I'm up on stage and I tell everybody how I open the door and I see this and I say, "Dennis, we got to get to Howard Stern in a minute." as I'm slowly walking out the door. So there's things like that you can talk about that are funny, that don't require me, being good at delivering punchlines.
Right.
And here's the other good part. People are coming to a comedy club, but nobody expects us to be funny. Their expectations are right there on the floor.
Right.
So if you could make them chuckle, you're like, "Oh my God, that's a huge win."
Right. Don't set the bar too high.
That guy giggled.
That's awesome.
You're giving me some confidence for this tour.
It's fun as hell, Pat. I got to tell you, there's nothing I enjoy more than doing that live show. I just have a blast.
And so the 83 weeks, you guys just kind of concentrate on that particular area. It's just dealing with those 83 weeks where you guys were kicking Vince McMahon's ass and Monday Night Raw's ass.
That's what we started out. We're almost 3/4 of the way through our first year. So you start running out of shit to talk about, right? So we're starting to broaden it to, my time in WWE or my time in TNA. We haven't crossed that threshold yet because it's a painful one, but we'll talk about all kinds of other stuff. But right now we're still focused on the Monday Night Wars.
Well, yeah, and I'm a huge wrestling mark, and I could probably talk to you for hours, but I run into, your Conrad Thompson's, Jim Cornette, his co-host, I forget his name, but a savant, it just, 1997 in Starrcade, why did this happen in this match? They remember the nuance of it, and I'm just like, wow, that's, I don't even go quite that hard, but it's,
Brother, I'm telling you, it's one of the challenges I have. It's like when you go to these, autograph signings and Q&As, or you're on a panel, and people that are, really big wrestling fans, they remember that shit. They remember, who was the third match of the second Starrcade, and what color was Ric Flair's tights when he wrestled Ronnie Garvin. It's like, what the fuck? How do you possibly have room for that shit in your head?
Dude, that's why when I saw, I think it was The Room for Three, it was you and Cornette. Maybe it was just you and Cornette. And you know how freaking Cornette's mind is. He's written down everything. And he did one of these diatribes like, "Eric, why did blah, 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 blah," and he just went off, and you're like, Jim, I don't really recall that. your response was so frank and just like.
Well, here's what that was. It was Michael Hayes was the guy, and Jim Cornette. We just went off on me, and for decades now he's been burying me, just everywhere, every opportunity he could possibly get. And then we sit down on this, table for three thing, and Michael Hayes was the moderator, and Jim goes off on this rant about all this evil shit that I supposedly did to him, and how I was responsible for, pulling the rug out from under him and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, whatever the fuck that was. But he goes on and on and on. And then Michael Hayes looks at him and says, "But Jim, you do know that Eric wasn't in charge during that time, right?"
Right.
And you could just see Cornette just sucked every ounce of wind out of his chest. It was like somebody hit him with a really crushing body blow in the solar plexus. He just collapsed. It was great.
Oh man, I
want to ask you,
Jim.
I'm trying to remember. Your son did some wrestling, didn't he? Garrett? Was it Garrett?
Yeah, my son broke into the business. I can't remember what year it was, probably around 2013 or 14. Yeah. He trained out in LA for about a year at Knox Pro Wrestling with Rikishi, and Rikishi's crew out there, Gangrel, a couple other great people, great trainers. He trained out there for a while, and he worked with Hulk Hogan and Brian Knobbs and that crew down in Tampa for a while. And then, we slowly broke him. He started out as a referee. Nobody knew his name. We kayfabed him to everybody. A couple people obviously knew he was my son, but the audience didn't know. We gave him a fake name, and we never connected the dots between us, so that when it was time to use him in a role, it was a complete shock to everybody. It was fun. It worked pretty well.
He's pretty jacked, too. He's not like an Eric Watts or a Nick Goulas' son. Like, Garrett's pretty jacked.
Yeah, he is jacked. He got into the martial arts when he was about 6 years old. He got his black belt, I think, when he was about 14 from Ernest the Cat Miller. Ernest Miller is a great martial artist, by the way. Super cool guy, too. Really, really cool guy. But, he got his black belt, and he just started training. He's been lifting hard, not like bodybuilding. He's more for functional strength than,
So he's a CrossFitter.
Well, he's not quite.
Yeah,
more along those lines. But he's in great shape. He's stayed clean, thank God, especially down in Florida. It's so easy to, take a shortcut down there. Right. But he stayed really clean, stayed really healthy, and he's loving. He's still doing a little independent wrestling right now.
Okay. So that, it's got to be. Boy, I tell you, the desire or the potential of seeing people around you looking like the Atlas brothers and all that sort of stuff. The desire's got to be there for some people, and wanting to reach that level of fame that so many have because of their physiques, and of course they had to have the acting skills and everything with the oracle skills. But that's a tough business to not get caught up in it, right?
It is, and I wasn't excited about him getting into the business. I tried in my own way to talk him out of it, just by being real. It's like anything else. Whether it's MMA or music or actors and actresses. 1% of the 1 or 2% of the people make 99% of the money,
right?
And everybody else is struggling to get along, get by. And with a last name like mine, like Bischoff, there was going to be plenty of doors that might open a little bit for him, but there'd be plenty more that would close hard on him. So I tried to talk him out of it, but he was committed and he just wanted to do it. And once he did, I was like, okay, well, then my job as a parent is to create the best possible opportunity I can for him, whether it was wrestling or becoming a firefighter. It's just, okay, what can I do to help him?
And what better learning tree to sit under, You clearly know what you're talking about.
Well, and he got to work. Garrett got to work with Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Kurt Angle, Jeff and Matt Hardy, AJ Styles, Samoa Joe. He got to work with some top people. And if nothing else, at least he'll be able to say, I had an opportunity to work with those guys and I had fun doing it. So that's a win in my book.
Great experiences.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that his career develops. Champ, do you got anything more for Eric? I'm
good. We don't need to keep him forever, I'm sure.
Well,
he's got things to do up there in Cody. But
of course.
I love that part of the country, man. I'm a little jealous of you having a house up there.
Exactly.
Well, we got to get you out here sometime in the summer. Don't come out in the winter. It's cold as hell here in the winter, but come out in the summer. We got a bunkhouse, got an extra horse.
Drop some plans for that new MMA organization.
All right, guys, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Ladies
Eric.
and gentlemen, Eric Bischoff right here on Everything Combat. Stay tuned. Peace and love. There'll always be more.